What does a woman do when she has buried her husband and is left with nothing but the clothes on her back and the judgment of an entire town? For Eliza Vance, standing in the biting wind of Cinder Creek, that wasn't just a question. It was her reality. She was a widow, left with no money, no home, and no protection. The townsfolk whispered, their eyes like little stones. And one man, her late husband's brother, looked at her not with pity, but with a cold possessive hunger. He was a man who took what he wanted. She was completely, terrifyingly alone. Her next step would be into starvation or into a life of shame in the town saloon. But then, from the back of the crowd, a voice cut through the silence. A man stepped forward, a man no one ever spoke to, a man scarred by a past he kept locked away. He offered her a third choice. Not a home, not kindness, but a job. A cold, hard contract that might be the only thing that could save her, or be a different kind of prison. This is a story of survival, courage, and how two broken people, abandoned by the world, and might just be able to rescue each other. Hello, and welcome to Frontier Rescue Stories. We're so glad to have you with us today. Before we ride into the high country and begin the story of Eliza and Silas, I have a small favor to ask. If you enjoy stories of the Old West, stories of love, redemption, and the unbreakable human spirit, please take just a moment to hit that like button. It truly helps our channel. And if you haven't already, click subscribe and ring that bell. It costs you nothing, but it helps us more than you know, allowing us to bring more of these stories to you and to a larger audience. Be sure to share this with anyone you think needs a great story today. And one last thing, we love our community. Please drop a comment below and let us know from which part of the world you are watching this story. Thank you. And now settle in. Our story begins in the bleak Wyoming winter in a town called Cinder Creek. The cold in Cinder Creek wasn't just in the air. It was in the hearts of the people. Eliza Vance felt it seeping into her bones, a chill more profound than the December wind that whipped her thin black shawl. She stood beside the fresh, mounded grave of her husband Thomas, the frozen earth a stark reminder of her new reality. The town of Cinder Creek, never friendly, had now become a place of open hostility. Thomas had been a weak man, given to drink and bad investments, but he had been a shield. Now that shield was gone. Her eyes drifted from the grave to the man standing near the church steps. Deacon Fletcher. He was Thomas's older brother, a man who shared none of his siblings' weakness, but instead possessed a casual cruelty that made Eliza's skin crawl. Deacon was auctioning off what little she had left. The debts of the deceased must be paid, he'd announced in the town square, a false sympathy in his voice. He sold their mule. He sold their wagon. He sold the very tools Thomas had barely used. Eliza watched as her life was dismantled, piece by piece under the watchful, whispering gaze of the town. Women like Minnie and Hattie, names common to the era, who she had nodded to in the general store, now looked away, or worse, whispered behind their hands. They saw her as a burden, a pariah. The unforgiving code of the frontier meant that a woman alone was a woman in peril, and Eliza was as alone as a human could be. Deacon approached her as the small crowd dispersed, the smell of cheap whiskey on his breath. "Well, Eliza," he said, his voice a low drawl, "it seems you're penniless. The good book says we must care for the widow. I have a room for you, above my saloon. You can work off your husband's remaining debts to me." His eyes roamed over her, and the implication was suffocating. It was not an offer of sanctuary. It was a sentence. Eliza recoiled, her voice, though trembling, was firm. "I will not." Deacon's smile was a sneer. "You'll be begging me for that room before the sun sets tomorrow," he said, turning and walking away, confident in her desperation. But as the sun began to dip, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple, Eliza did not go to the saloon. She sat on the cold church steps, the last light of her old life fading and the full, terrifying darkness of her future settling in. She had no food, no money, and nowhere to go. The reality of frontier survival was not about fighting off wolves. It was about this: the cold, the hunger, and the predatory nature of men like Deacon Fletcher. The town sheriff, a man named Jeb, finally approached her, his face etched with weary duty. "Mrs. Vance," he said, not unkindly, "you can't stay here. Deacon's right, you've got no claim. I'll have to escort you to the county line come morning. You're a vagrant." By the law, he was, in effect, sentencing her to death in the wilderness. Eliza looked up at Sheriff Jeb, the words "county line" hanging in the frigid air like a puff of frozen breath. It was a death sentence. To be cast out of town in the dead of winter, with no mule, no food, and no coat, was to be left for the elements. It was a fate she wouldn't wish on anyone, yet it was the one being handed to her. She felt a cold, hard knot of despair tighten in her stomach. Deacon Fletcher was watching from across the street, a silhouette in the doorway of his saloon, waiting for her to break, to come crawling. Eliza pulled her shawl tighter, her pride the only thing she had left. "I understand, Sheriff," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I will be gone by morning." She would walk, and she would walk until she could walk no more. The sheriff sighed, about to turn away, when a new voice spoke, cutting through the twilight. It was a voice few in Cinder Creek ever heard, deep and rough, like stones grinding together. "She won't be a vagrant." Every head turned. From the shadows of the livery, a man emerged. He was tall, broad, and moved with a quiet, dangerous grace. The left side of his face was a tapestry of old, silvery scars, pulling at the corner of his eye and disappearing into his thick beard. This was Silas Croft. He owned the Stony Ridge Ranch, a place far up in the high country, a place people said was haunted by bad luck and isolation. He was a man who came to town twice a year for supplies, spoke to no one, and left. The town was, quite frankly, afraid of him. Silas did not look at Deacon. He did not look at the sheriff. His gaze was fixed solely on Eliza. He stopped a few feet from her, his presence a solid, unmoving wall. "I need a housekeeper," he stated. It was not an offer. It was a fact. "My cabin is in disarray. The work is hard. The pay is shelter and food, 1 year. A contract." He pulled a crumpled piece of paper and a pencil from his coat. "The sheriff can witness it." The entire street was silent. Deacon Fletcher's face, visible in the gaslight from his saloon, was a mask of disbelief and rage. He had seen Eliza as a broken thing he could own, and now this half-wild recluse was interfering. "Now hold on, Croft," Deacon sputtered, striding forward. "The woman has debts." "I'll pay her debts," Silas said, his voice flat, his scarred eye never leaving Eliza's. He reached into his pocket and tossed a small, heavy pouch of coin at Deacon's feet. It landed in the dust with a dull thud. "That should cover whatever you invented." Deacon, for the first time, looked intimidated. He was a bully, but Silas Croft was not a man to be bullied. Silas turned his full attention back to Eliza. The town, the sheriff, Deacon, they all faded away. It was just her and this strange, scarred man. He wasn't offering kindness. He wasn't offering friendship. He was offering, as he said, survival. "Well, Mrs. Vance? The work is hard, and I am not a man for conversation. But I am an honest one." Eliza looked at Deacon's simmering rage, at the cold, unforgiving street, and then back at the man who looked like he'd been carved from the very mountains he lived on. She saw no pity in his eyes. She saw nothing, just an offer, a way out. She stood up, her legs shaking, and nodded once. "I accept." Silas Croft retrieved his pouch after Deacon. His face purple with rage, had counted out the coin, and then gestured for Eliza to follow him. "My wagon is at the livery," was all he said. She followed him, a silent shadow, not daring to look back at the town that had cast her out. The wagon was loaded with sacks of flour, salt, and other provisions. Silas tossed her small bundled belongings in the back, then offered a hand, not to help her up, but to steady the wagon as she climbed onto the hard wooden seat. He untied the horses, climbed up beside her, and with a single click of his tongue, they were moving. The ride from Cinder Creek, a town name suggesting a harsh, burnt-out place, was as silent as the grave she had just left. The only sounds were the creak of the wagon wheels, the snort of the horses, and the relentless sigh of the wind. The landscape changed as they climbed. The rolling plains gave way to sharp, rocky foothills, the terrain growing more rugged and unforgiving. They were following a trail that was barely a trail, winding higher into the mountains. Eliza clutched her shawl, her body aching from the cold and the tension. She stole a glance at the man beside her. He was a complete unknown. She had traded the clear and present danger of Deacon Fletcher for a life of isolation with a man the entire town whispered about. Was he a good man? Was he a monster? His face in the fading light gave away nothing. He seemed as hard and as remote as the land itself. After an hour, as the last sliver of sun disappeared, he spoke, his voice startling her. "There are rules," he said, his eyes fixed on the trail ahead. "My house is my own. There is one room that is locked. It stays locked. You do your work. You cook, you clean, you mend. I will provide for you," You will be safe from the town, and you will be safe at my ranch. Do not pry into my affairs. Do you understand?" Eliza, her throat dry, simply nodded. "Yes." He grunted, and that was the end of the conversation. The rest of the ride, another 2 hours, was in complete darkness, the horses seeming to know the way by instinct. Eliza's fear began to morph into a deep, profound weariness. She was no longer just afraid. She was exhausted, soul deep. She had survived, but what kind of life was this? Finally, Silas pulled the wagon to a halt. "We're here." Eliza looked into the gloom. She could make out the dark shape of a small, solid cabin and a larger barn, nestled in a small valley, surrounded by towering pines and sheer rock faces. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. "Stony Ridge Ranch," he said, the name echoing the ruggedness of the landscape. It was barely a ranch. It was a homestead, a fortress against the world. He got down and lit a lantern. "The kitchen is stocked. Your room is the small one off the back. I sleep in the loft." He didn't help her down. He didn't show her in. He began unhitching the team. Eliza sat there for a moment, frozen. Then, taking a deep breath, she slid down from the wagon, her legs stiff. She picked up her small bundle and walked to the cabin door. She pushed it open. A wave of cold, still air hit her face. It was dark and it was silent. It was the smell of old wood, cold ashes, and something else. A profound, lingering sadness. She stepped inside and the door clicked shut behind her. She was utterly and completely alone. Eliza stood in darkness of cabin, her heart pounding a heavy, slow rhythm against her ribs. She fumbled in her pocket for matches she'd salvaged, striking one. The small flame flared, pushing back the shadows. She found a kerosene lamp on a small table and lit it. The cabin was revealed in a pool of dim yellow light. It was stark. To one side was a small, clean-swept kitchen with a large cast-iron stove and a rough-hewn table. To other was a small living area, with a cold fireplace, 2 wooden chairs, and a threadbare rug. There were 3 doors. One, she assumed, led to small room he'd mentioned. The other, she saw, was a sturdy pantry. And third, at far end of room, was one he had warned her about. It was made of thick, dark wood and had a heavy iron lock. She found her room. It was tiny, barely more than a closet, with a simple cot and a small chest. But it was clean, and Dower had a small wooden latch on inside. That, more than anything, made her breathe a little easier. She could hear Silas outside, tending to horses. She knew what she had to do. Her survival depended on her utility. She was no longer a wife or a citizen. She was a housekeeper. She took off her shawl, rolled up her sleeves, and set to work. She found kindling and started a fire in big stove. Warmth slowly, grudgingly, filling the room. She found potatoes, onions, and salt pork in the pantry. By time Silas finally came in, stamping the snow from his boots, the cabin was warmer, and the smell of a simple stew was in the air. He stopped, just inside the door, and looked around. He seemed almost surprised. He said nothing, simply hung his coat on a peg and sat at the table. Eliza served him a bowl, then one for herself, and they ate in complete, resounding silence. The man was a ghost in his own home. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent routine. Eliza would rise before dawn, light the fires, and make coffee and biscuits. Silas would already be gone, tending to his few cattle. He would eat the dinner she left for him, long after she had retired to her room. They were 2 people living in the same small space, but they were worlds apart. The cabin, she realized, was a house of ghosts. It was clean, yes, but it was empty. There were no pictures, no trinkets, no sign of a life lived. It was as if someone had scrubbed the very memory of personality from the walls. All except for that locked door. It loomed in her vision, a constant, silent question. What was he protecting? Or what was he hiding from? One afternoon, while sweeping her small room, her broom hit a loose floorboard. Curious, she knelt and lifted it. Tucked beneath, wrapped in a small piece of cloth, was a small carved wooden bird. Its wing was broken. It was without a doubt a child's toy. She stared at it, the small broken thing, and her heart ached. The ghost in this house, she realized, had names. She quickly, carefully rewrapped the toy and placed it back, pushing the floorboard into place. The iron grip of winter finally began to loosen. The snow, which had been a suffocating blanket, started to recede, revealing the hard, frozen ground beneath. The sound of dripping water from the eaves was, to Eliza, the most hopeful sound in the world. She had survived the deepest part of the winter, and the silent monastic routine of the cabin. She and Silas still barely spoke. Their conversations We're limited to the coffee is hot, or we're low on salt. But a strange, unspoken rhythm had developed. She mended his socks. He left a brace of rabbits already cleaned by the door. It was a partnership based purely on necessity, a shared existence in the face of the harsh frontier. One afternoon, seeking a few moments of fresh air, Eliza explored the area just behind the cabin. There, sheltered by a low stone wall, she found it, a small, fallow garden plot. It was a wreck, overgrown with the dead, brown skeletons of last year's weeds, the small picket fence surrounding it broken and collapsing. But the potential was there. It faced south. It was protected from the worst of the wind. It was a place where something could live. A sudden, desperate need rose up in Eliza. It was more than a desire. It was a physical hunger. She needed to make something grow. It was a way to prove, if only to herself, that she was more than a ghost, more than just a survivor. She needed to be a creator. She began the work with nothing but her own 2 hands. She pulled the tough, stubborn weeds, her fingers raw and bleeding in the cold. She used a broken spade she'd found by the barn to try and turn the dense, rocky soil. It was back-breaking, thankless work. She was sure Silas, from the barn where he was mending a harness, was watching her, probably thinking she was a fool, wasting her energy. She didn't care. She worked until the sun dipped behind the ridge and her muscles screamed in protest. That night she fell into her cot, exhausted but for the first time, feeling a sense of purpose. The next morning when she stepped outside into the cold dawn, she stopped. Leaning against the cabin wall, right by the door, was a set of tools. An iron-tined fork, a sturdy hoe, and a proper shovel. They were old, but the wooden handles were smooth, and the metal was clean and sharp. Silas was already gone, his tracks leading up to the high pasture. He had said nothing. He hadn't offered to help. But this was a conversation. This was an acknowledgement. Eliza picked up the hoe, the handle fitting surprisingly well in her grip. She walked to the small plot, and on the gatepost, a new, small tin caught her eye. She opened it. Inside were seeds, beans, squash, and corn, the basics, the things one needed to live. A small, strange feeling fluttered in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was hope. She held the tin of seeds, the metal cold against her palm. And for the first time since she'd arrived at Stony Ridge, Eliza Vance smiled. The garden became Eliza's sanctuary. It was a piece of the world she could control. Taming the wild soil was a mirror to taming her own wild grief and fear. Silas, true to his word, never offered to help, but she'd find rocks she'd dug up had been piled neatly by the wall in the morning, or that the broken fence had been mended with fresh-cut pine. They were building a life, or something like it, in a language that had no words. But the locked door remained. It was a silent third occupant in the small cabin, a constant reminder of the past he kept buried. It was the one part of the house she was forbidden to clean, and it gathered a fine layer of dust which seemed to mock her. The thaw of spring gave way to the dry, hot breath of summer, and with the summer came the storms. One afternoon the sky turned a sick, greenish yellow. The air became heavy and still. Eliza, who had grown up on the plains, recognized the signs. "A big one is coming, Mr. Croft," she said as he came in from the barn. He just nodded, his eyes on the horizon. A twister. They didn't have a root cellar, only the cabin. "Bar the shutters," he commanded, and she didn't hesitate. They worked together, securing the animals in the reinforced barn, and then battening down the cabin. The storm hit them like a freight train. It was not a tornado, but a wind so violent it threatened to tear the cabin from its very foundations. The air was filled with the shriek of 1,000 demons. They sat in the dark, lamps extinguished, only light coming from cracks in the shutters. The wind roared, and then there was a sound that made them both jolt. A crash, not from outside, but within-house. The wind had found a weakness. A section of roof, directly over locked room, had torn open. Rain and debris began to pour in. Silas swore, a low guttural sound. He scrambled for door, but it was locked. He fumbled for the key on his belt, but it wasn't there. I left it in the barn," he said, his voice raw with a panic Eliza had never heard. He was terrified. Not of storm, but of what storm was doing to that room. "It's just water, Silas," Eliza began, but he let out a roar. "No." He grabbed a fireplace poker and, with a strength that shocked her, smashed iron lock, splintering wood. He threw door open and rushed inside. Eliza, holding the lantern, followed him, her heart in her throat. The wind howled through hole in the roof. and the lantern light fell upon the contents of room. Eliza gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. It was a nursery. A beautifully crafted wooden cradle, a small rocking horse, shelves lined with tiny, neatly folded clothes. And on wall, a portrait of a smiling woman with dark hair, holding a baby. The rain was pouring onto cradle. Silas was on his knees, desperately trying to move it, to shield the portrait with his own body. He was not just protecting a room, he was protecting a shrine. And Eliza, standing in doorway, finally understood true depth of the man's scars. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving a trail of destruction. The roof over nursery was a gaping wound, and room's precious contents were soaked. Silas, his face a mask of grim anguish, had not spoken a word since Eliza had seen inside. The tension in cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. He had seen her see his secret, the heart of his pain, and now the silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was strained and sharp. They spent the next day in a frantic, awkward partnership, patching roof with spare lumber from the barn. They worked side by side, their shoulders nearly touching, but they were emotionally miles apart. He was trapped in his grief, and she was an intruder who had trespassed on it. By the second afternoon, the patch was complete. The air was hot, humid, and dangerously still. Eliza was hanging nursery's soaked blankets and quilts on a line, trying to salvage them, when Silas suddenly froze. He was on cabin roof, hammer in hand. He stopped, sniffing the air, his head tilted. "What is it?" Eliza called up. "Smoke," he said, his voice low and tight. He pointed to the south. A faint, hazy plume was rising against clear blue sky. It wasn't a chimney. It was too big. "A dry lightning strike," he said, climbing down ladder with a speed that startled her. "And wind is picking up." Within an hour, it was no longer a plume. It was a wall. A red wall of fire moving faster than a horse could run. The frontier, which had threatened them with cold and wind, now threatened them with fire. All the awkwardness, all unspoken grief, was burned away in an instant, replaced by the single, primal urge to survive. "The creek!" Silas yelled. "It's our only fire break. We have to stop it from jumping." He ran to the barn and emerged with shovels, axes, and a pile of old burlap sacks. "Eliza, fill every bucket we have." "Soak the sacks. Soak blankets. We have to wet the cabin roof." There was no time for fear. Eliza ran. She worked with a frantic energy she didn't know she possessed. She hauled water, her muscles screaming, her lungs burning. He met her at creek bed, a shallow, slow-moving stream that marked edge of their property. The fire was roaring now, a living, breathing monster, devouring the dry prairie grass. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with smoke and ash. "We backburn from creek," he shouted over the roar. "We fight it here." He lit a torch and began setting a controlled fire, burning the grass back toward Inferno, creating a black, burned-out line that fire hopefully could not cross. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. Embers, carried on wind, were landing all around them. "Eliza, the sacks. Beat the embers. Don't let it cross the creek." She did as she was told, running along the creek bank, her eyes stinging, her face streaked with ash, beating out the small fires that threatened to doom them. They were in a desperate, terrifying dance. Two small human figures against an apocalyptic blaze. For hours they fought. The world was reduced to smoke, heat, and the rhythmic, exhausting thud of wet sacks against smoldering grass. The main fire front roared past, a terrifying spectacle of orange and black. But the backburn in the creek had held. The fire had not jumped. The Stony Ridge Ranch and the two people who called it home were saved. As the inferno moved on, leaving a blackened, smoking landscape in its wake, Eliza and Silas collapsed on the muddy bank of the creek. They were alive. They were covered in soot, ash and sweat, their clothes singed, their faces unrecognizable. Eliza was coughing, her lungs aching, but she had never felt so intensely alive. She looked at Silas. He was leaning against a boulder, his head in his hands, his whole body trembling from exhaustion. She saw that his hands, which he'd used to beat out the flames with a shovel, were raw and blistered. A long red burn snaked up his forearm where a flying ember had caught him. The sight of his pain cut through her own exhaustion. She stood on shaky legs, dipped her shawl in the cool creek water, and went to him. She knelt in the mud beside him. "Your arm," she said, her voice a hoarse croak. Silas flinched as she reached for him. It was a sharp, instinctive recoil, not from the pain of the burn, but from her touch. Eliza froze, her hand hovering. He had been a fortress of solitude for so long. and she was once again trespassing. "Let me," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Please?" He stared at her for a long moment, his scarred face unreadable. Then slowly he uncurled his arm and let it rest, palm up on his knee. He relented. Gently, Eliza began to clean the wound, washing away the soot and ash. As the water cleared the grime, she saw the other scars that crisscrossed his arms, old, white, and deep. The scars of a life lived in hardness and pain. But this new one, this red, angry burn, she could tend to. He didn't pull away. He sat rigid watching her. The simple human contact was something so foreign to them both. It felt like a sacrament. He had fought the fire to save the ranch. She had fought it to save him and herself. "Thank you," he finally whispered, his voice rough. "For not running." Eliza finished tying the wet cloth around the burn. She looked up, her gaze meeting his. "I had nowhere to run to," she said honestly. "Besides, my wife, Anna." He choked out the name, the first time he'd ever spoken it to her. She was terrified of fire. He couldn't finish. Eliza simply nodded, her hand still resting on his arm. "I'm not Anna," she said softly. The silence that fell between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken, and deeply fragile understanding. Weeks passed, and the rhythms of the ranch shifted. The fire had left a scar on the land, but as the first autumn rains came, a faint, hopeful green began to push through the black. The garden had survived, shielded by the creek, and its harvest was a bounty of beans, squash, and corn. But the biggest change was in the cabin. The silence was different. It was no longer a cold, empty void, but a shared, comfortable quiet. Silas spoke more. He told Eliza the names of the mountains. He taught her how to track a deer, and he even, one evening, explained that the broken wooden bird had belonged to his son, Thomas. He called her Eliza now, not Mrs. Vance. Eliza, in turn, had grown stronger. The sun and the hard work had put color in her cheeks, and the fear that had haunted her eyes had been replaced by a calm, steady confidence. They were two survivors, partners in the truest sense, rebuilding a life from the ashes. It was this new, peaceful dynamic that was shattered one bright October morning by the sound of an approaching rider. Eliza was in the garden, and her blood ran cold. It was not Silas who was up in the pastures. It was Deacon Fletcher. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the scene with a mix of surprise and contempt. He saw the mended roof, the thriving garden, the healthy livestock, and he saw her. This was not the broken, gaunt widow he'd tried to force into his saloon. This was a strong, capable woman, her hands dirty with honest earth. His gaze turned possessive. Well, he drawled, swinging down from his horse. "Looks like the hermit's been keeping you well fed, Eliza. I'm surprised." "Heard you two had a close call with that fire." Eliza stood, her garden hoe held firmly in her hand. "What do you want, Deacon?" He laughed, a wheezing, unpleasant sound. "Just a neighborly visit. Came to see how you were coping." He walked closer, his eyes raking over her. "You know, this hardscrabble life. It'll kill you. Cinder Creek is civilized. I'm a forgiving man. My offer still stands. A nice warm room, good food. Easy work." He was implying she was Silas's property, his kept woman, a fate no different from the one he'd offered. But he'd also heard that Silas's land was better than he thought, that the creek was a reliable water source. "Truth is," he continued, "I came to make your guardian an offer. This land is too much for a man like him. I'm prepared to buy him out. And, of course, I'd be happy to take you off his hands as part of the bargain." The insult, the sheer arrogance of the man, made Eliza see red. "I am not part of a bargain," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "You should leave." "Oh." "I'm not leaving," Deacon sneered, "until I speak with the man of the house." Just then, the sound of a rifle bolt clicking shut echoed from the barn. "He's not the man of the house. We are." Silas stepped out of the shadows, his rifle resting in the crook of his arm, his face a thundercloud. His scarred eyes seemed to burn. "She's not a burden. And my land's not for sale. Get off my property, Fletcher." "You were told once." Deacon Fletcher's face hardened, his hand instinctively dropping to pistol at his hip. "Croft," he sneered, trying to regain his footing. "You think you can hide her up here forever?" "She's a fallen woman, and whole town knows it. She's got a reputation." "What are you, her white knight?" He laughed, a bitter barking sound. "You can't protect her from what people say. She's tainted goods." He turned his attention back to Eliza. His eyes filled with a cruel, dismissive pity. He can't give you anything, Eliza. A scarred-up cabin and a scarred-up man. Is that what you want?
I'm offering you a real life. Warmth, money, protection. Come with me.
Right now, and I'll even marry you. Make you respectable. It was ultimate temptation. One thing a woman in her position was supposed to want. Respectability. A name. A place in world. Silas tensed, his knuckles white on rifle. He was ready to fight, to kill for her. But he waited. This was not his decision. Eliza looked at Deacon. At Easy Life he offered a life in a cage, owned by a man she despised. Then she looked at Silas, at the hard, demanding, honest life he offered. A life of shared work, of quiet respect, of survival. She had been a victim in Cinder Creek. She had been a housekeeper at Stony Ridge. But now, in this moment, she was something more. She was a partner. Before Silas could take a step, Eliza stepped forward, garden hose still in her hand. She was no longer broken woman from town square. I am not your property, Deacon, she said, her voice clear and ringing with a strength that shocked them both. I was never your property. She planted hoe in dirt and stood tall. I'm not tainted goods. I am a woman who has worked for every bite I've eaten, and for every night of safety. This scarred-up cabin, she glanced back at Silas, a small, fierce smile on her face. This is my home. I helped rebuild that roof. That is my garden. I am not going anywhere. Deacon was stunned. He had come expecting to find a broken bird. He'd found an eagle. He looked at Eliza's unbending strength, and at Silas, who stood beside her, a solid, unmoving guardian. For first time, Deacon Fletcher realized he had lost. He had no power here. The rules of town, whispers and shame, they meant nothing on this ridge. He spat on ground. You're a fool, Eliza, both of you. You'll regret this. You'll be dead by winter, or you'll be begging me to take you back. He swung himself onto his horse, his face a mask of rage. This isn't over. He wrenched the horse's head around and galloped away, a retreating cloud of dust and anger. Silence that followed was immense. Threat was gone. Eliza's shoulders slumped, adrenaline leaving her. She was trembling. Silas put a hand on her shoulder, his touch warm and steady. He didn't take his eyes off retreating rider. He just stood there, a guardian. Finally, he turned to her, his face unreadable, his voice filled with a quiet awe. You chose this hard life. Eliza looked up at Silas, his question hanging in the crisp autumn air. You chose this? She didn't have to think. She looked at the cabin they had saved from the fire, at the garden she had brought to life, and at the man who had offered her a contract and had given her a home. This is not a hard life, Silas, she said softly. This is an honest one. I chose us. The word hung between them, new and powerful. Us. It was a word that redefined everything. He had rescued her from the town, but she had just rescued him from Deacon. His hand on her shoulder tightened, just for a moment, a silent acknowledgement. They had been two solitary survivors, but Deacon's threat had forged them into something new, a partnership, a family. That evening, the shared victory over Deacon broke the final wall between them. The cabin felt warmer, safer. After a quiet dinner, Silas did something he hadn't done since the storm. He stood before the boarded-up nursery door. Eliza had cleaned the room, salvaged the furniture, and then, respecting his unspoken grief, had closed the door, leaving it to him. He turned to her, the key, the one he'd retrieved from the barn, in his hand. Anna, he began, his voice quiet. My wife, she was from back east. She wasn't made for this land. She hated the wind, the isolation. He unlocked the door and pushed it open. But this time he walked in and motioned for Eliza to follow. He picked up the small, repaired wooden bird from the cradle, the one he had carved, the mate to the broken one she'd found. And this was for Thomas, our son. He told her the story, the one the town had probably whispered about, but the one she had never heard from him. It was a blizzard 3 years prior. He'd tried to get them to town. The storm had come up, faster than he'd ever seen. I thought I knew the trail, he said, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw. I got lost. We sheltered, but it wasn't enough. I found them in the morning, frozen. I brought them back here. He ran a hand over the smooth wood of the cradle. I locked this room. I thought if I locked the door, I could lock the pain away. I could keep them safe in here, even though they were gone. He looked at Eliza, His eyes, for the first time, completely clear of shadows, only a deep, profound sadness.
But the pain.
It doesn't stay locked, does it? It was always in here. He touched his chest. Always. Eliza's heart ached for him. She reached out, and this time, she was the one to offer comfort. She gently took his large, calloused, scarred hand in both of hers. "No," she whispered. "It doesn't. But you don't have to hold it alone anymore, Silas." The nursery door was never locked again. But it also, by a quiet, mutual understanding, was not a nursery anymore. It was a room of memory, not a tomb of grief. Slowly, together, they began to change it. It was Eliza's idea. "We need a pantry for the winter," she'd said, "a real one, for all the food from the garden," and Silas had agreed. They moved the cradle, the small chair, and the portrait into the loft where Silas slept, not to be forgotten, but to be honored. In their place, they built shelves. They filled jars with preserved beans, dried corn, and squash. The room that had once been a symbol of a tragic past was now, quite literally, the foundation of their shared future. It was a room full of life, of preparation, of hope. The first snow of the season came. A gentle, quiet blanket, not the biting, cruel winter of the year before. It found the Stony Ridge Ranch ready. The barn was full of hay, the woodshed was piled high, and the cabin was warm. Eliza and Silas had fallen into a partnership that was as solid as the mountains around them. It was a love story, but one written in shared work, not flowery words. It was in the way he'd built her a new, sturdy chair to sit by the fire. It was in the way she mended his coat, reinforcing the seams. It was a love built on survival and deepened by redemption. One evening they sat by the fire, the wind howling outside, but they were safe. Silas was whittling. Eliza was mending a sock. The silence was comfortable, complete. He'd been working on a piece of pine for days, and now he was finally done. He held it out to her. I fixed it," he said. Eliza put down her mending and opened her hand. He placed a small, perfectly carved wooden bird in her palm. It was a perfect match for the broken one she had found. But this one was new, its wings whole and strong. She looked up at him, her eyes shining. It was not a ring. It was not a proposal. It was a promise. It was everything. Eliza closed her hand around the small bird, her heart full. "It's beautiful, Silas." He looked at her, and for the first time, he gave her a true, genuine smile, one that lit up his scarred face and chased away the last of the ghosts. "Winter's here," he said, his voice soft. Eliza smiled back, her hand closing around his. "I know," she replied, "and we'll be ready." And so the winter comes to Stony Ridge, but this time it finds a home filled with warmth, and two hearts, no longer broken, but mended and strong. Thank you so much for joining us at Frontier Rescue. Stories for the tale of Eliza and Silas. If their story of courage and redemption touched your heart, we would be so grateful if you would like this video, share it with someone who loves a great story, and subscribe to our channel. It is the best way to help us keep these stories alive. And be sure to check out our channel playlist for more stories of survival and hope from the untamed frontier. But now, we want to hear from you. What did you think of Eliza's courage? And what moment in this story was your favorite? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one. We're always looking for our next great tale. Do you have a story of love, survival, or redemption you'd like to hear us tell? Let us know your suggestions. From all of us here at Frontier Rescue Stories, we wish you warmth, safety, and all the best. We'll see you in the next story.